If she dies, you'll never hear your name the same way again. That was the first thing the doctor said. And I remember thinking how strange it was that a man like me, someone who never waited, never hesitated, was suddenly frozen in the middle of a room I controlled, with people who wouldn't even breathe too loudly around me. And yet none of that power mattered because all I could hear was her name echoing in my head like a warning I had ignored for too long. Maya Carter. The girl who once looked at me like I wasn't something to be feared, but something to be understood. And I should have known that night when she walked away from me under a quiet streetlight that losing her would not be loud. It would be silent, like something slipping through your fingers before you realize you were holding it at all. But I didn't understand then. Not until the call came at 2:13 in the morning, and the voice on the other end said she was fighting to live and saying my name like it was the only thing tethering her to this world. And suddenly the air felt thinner. The room smaller, my chest tighter than any situation I had ever faced, and I moved before I could think, before anyone could speak, out the door, into the night, into the rain that hit the pavement like 1,000 quiet warnings I had ignored, my car engine roaring to life as I pushed it harder than I ever had, the speed climbing past 80, then 90 miles per hour, red lights turning into suggestions instead of rules. Because rules had never applied to me, but this felt different. This felt like something I couldn't control no matter how fast I drove or how tightly I gripped the wheel. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't chasing power or protecting territory or making decisions that shaped the city. I was chasing a single heartbeat that might stop before I got there. And every mile felt like a question I couldn't answer. Why her? Why now? Why me? And the worst part wasn't the fear, it was the memory. The way her voice used to sound when she said my name like it meant something soft instead of something dangerous. The way she stood her ground when everyone else stepped back. The way she once told me, almost casually, "You don't scare me." And I had laughed then, because everyone should have been scared of me. That was the point. That was the life I had built. But she didn't play by those rules. She never did. And now those same words echoed in my head as I pulled into the hospital parking lot. The tires screeching just slightly as I stopped too fast. The building rising in front of me like something sterile and indifferent, all glass and light and silence. And when I stepped inside, something shifted, not in the world, but in me, because for once, no one moved out of my way fast enough. No one reacted the way they usually did, and I realized it was because I wasn't looking at them. I wasn't seeing anything except the hallway stretching ahead of me and the sound of my own footsteps, slower now, heavier, like each one carried something I didn't want to name, until I reached the door and saw her, Maya, lying still in a bed that looked too white, too clean, machines beside her humming quietly like they were trying to keep a secret I wasn't ready to hear. And for a second, just a second, I didn't move, because seeing her like that didn't match anything in my memory. Not the girl who laughed too easily, not the one who argued with me like she had nothing to lose, not the one who walked away when she should have stayed. And I stepped closer anyway, because I didn't know how to do anything else, my hand reaching out almost on its own, hesitating just before it touched hers. Like even that small contact might break something fragile I didn't understand. But when I finally did, when my fingers wrapped around hers, there was a moment, just a flicker, where I felt it, the slightest movement, like she was still there somewhere beneath the silence. And then I heard it, barely more than a breath, my name. And it hit me harder than anything ever had, not because it was loud, but because it wasn't, because it was weak and fading and still somehow stronger than anything else in that room. And I leaned closer without thinking, my voice lower than I'd ever heard it, saying her name like it might anchor her. The way hers anchored me, and that's when I noticed the details I had missed at first, the way the doctor stood too still, the way the nurse avoided my eyes, the way something felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, and I looked up slowly, my grip tightening just slightly, not enough to hurt, just enough to remind myself she was still there, and I asked the question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. What happened? And the silence that followed told me everything I needed to know before a single word was spoken, because it wasn't just an accident, it wasn't just bad timing or wrong place, it was something else, something connected, something that reached further than this room, further than her, further than me. And as I looked back down at her, at the girl who once told me I wasn't a monster, I realized something I had never allowed myself to think before, that maybe she was here because of me, that maybe the world I controlled had reached out and touched the one person who didn't belong in it. And as her fingers tightened just barely against mine, as her lips moved again like she was trying to say something that mattered, I understood that whatever this was, whatever had put her here, I wasn't going to walk away from it. Not this time, not again. Because if she didn't make it, it wouldn't just be her I lost. It would be the last piece of me that still believed I could be something more than what I had become. I did not raise my voice, not when the doctor finally spoke, not when the words settled into something cold and precise. But something inside me shifted anyway, something quieter and far more dangerous than anger, because anger could be loud and careless. But this was not that. This was focus, and I turned my head just slightly, enough for my eyes to meet his, and I asked him to explain again, slower this time, every detail, every second, every assumption he had already made, and every doubt he had chosen not to say out loud. And he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, the kind of hesitation people have when they realize they are speaking to someone who does not accept incomplete answers. And then he told me what they knew, that she had been brought in late, that there were no clear witnesses, that it looked like an accident at first, but there were inconsistencies, small ones, the kind most people would ignore, but not him, not me, not anymore. And as he spoke, I kept my hand wrapped around hers, feeling the faint warmth that reminded me she was still here, still fighting, still saying my name like it mattered. And I let the silence stretch between his sentences, because silence makes people reveal more than they intend, and he did, eventually, mentioning that her belongings had not all been recovered, that her phone was missing, that the timeline did not quite align with what they had been told, and that was enough, more than enough, because accidents do not erase details, people do. And I nodded once, slowly, like I understood something simple instead of something that rewrote the entire situation. And when he finished, I did not thank him, I did not reassure him, I just said I would take it from here, and the way his shoulders dropped told me he understood exactly what that meant without me having to explain it. And when he stepped back, giving me space that I had not asked for but always received, I looked down at her again, at the girl who never asked for any of this, who never wanted anything from me except honesty, something I had never been good at giving, and I leaned closer, my voice low enough that it belonged only to us, telling her she needed to stay, that she was not allowed to leave yet, that I was not finished fixing what I had broken, and I did not know if she could hear me. But her fingers shifted again, just barely, like a response that existed somewhere between this world and another, and that was enough to keep me there for one more second, and then another, until I forced myself to stand, because staying beside her without doing anything would be the same as leaving her there. And I was done with leaving, completely done, and when I stepped into the hallway, everything felt sharper, clearer, like the world had narrowed into something I could finally control again. But this time it was not about power, it was about precision, and I pulled my phone from my pocket, dialing a number I had not used in months, because I had not needed to, because most problems solved themselves when people knew my name. But this was different. This required more than reputation. This required certainty. And when the line connected, I did not waste time with greetings or explanations. I just said I needed everything. Every camera, every street, every person who had crossed her path in the last 12 hours. And I wanted it now, not later, not filtered, not interpreted, just the truth, in its rawest form. And there was a pause on the other end, not of confusion, but of recognition, because they could hear it in my voice, the difference, the shift, the absence of anything unnecessary, and they agreed without questions, because they knew better than to ask. And when I ended the call, I stayed still for a moment, not because I did not know what to do next, but because I did, and I needed to make sure I was ready for it, because whatever I found would not be something I could ignore, not this time, not when it involved her. And I turned back toward the room, just long enough to see her again through the glass, small against the white sheets, surrounded by machines that measured things I could not control, and I realized something I had avoided for a long time, that all the influence I had built, all the decisions I had made, all the ways I had shaped the world around me, none of it could guarantee that she would open her eyes again, none of it could force her to stay, and that truth settled into me like something heavy and permanent, not something to escape, but something to carry, and I accepted it, because accepting it meant I would not waste time pretending I could fix everything with a single move. It meant I would have to earn this, every second she stayed, every breath she took, every chance I still had. And as I turned away again, walking down the hallway with the same controlled pace I always used, I knew that somewhere out there was the answer. Not a mystery, not a coincidence, but a decision someone had made, a chain of choices that had led her here, and I was going to follow it back to the beginning, not to punish, not to prove anything, but to understand, because understanding was the only way to make sure this never happened again. And as I reached the exit, the doors sliding open with a soft mechanical sound, the night air hitting my face colder than before, I realized the most dangerous part of all of this was not what I was about to find. It was what I was willing to become if it meant she would have a reason to say my name again when she woke up. I have learned that the truth does not arrive all at once. It comes in fragments, in quiet details that only make sense when you stop looking for noise. And that was exactly how it started, not with a name, not with a face, but with a timestamp on a grainy piece of footage that should have meant nothing and somehow meant everything. Because it showed her, Maya, stepping out into the night hours before she ended up in that hospital bed. Her shoulders relaxed, her pace steady, completely unaware that something had already shifted around her. And I watched it once, then again, then a third time, not because I needed to see it, but because I needed to feel it. The moment before everything changed, the moment I had not been there, and the room around me stayed silent while the screens flickered, men waiting for instructions I had not given yet, because I was still listening, still piecing it together. And when I finally spoke, my voice did not rise, it did not sharpen, it stayed even, controlled, the way it always did when the situation mattered more than appearances. And I asked for the next angle, the next camera, the next piece of the city that might have noticed what no one else had. And they moved quickly, pulling up intersections, traffic feeds, private security recordings from buildings that did not usually share anything without a reason. But I had always been very good at giving people reasons. And the story unfolded slowly, not dramatic, not obvious, just a sequence of movements that felt wrong in a way you could not explain until you saw it from the right perspective. A car that appeared too often, always at the edge of the frame, never close enough to be noticed, never far enough to disappear completely, and I leaned forward. Slightly, my hand resting against the edge of the table as I watched it pass through one screen, then another, like it was following a path that had already been decided. And that was when I understood, not completely, but enough, because accidents do not repeat patterns, people do. And I did not need anyone to tell me that this was not random, that someone had chosen her, or worse, that someone had chosen me and she had simply been closer. And that thought settled into me in a way that did not feel like anger. It felt like clarity, the kind that strips away everything unnecessary until only the truth remains. And I stood without saying anything, the room shifting around me as people straightened, waiting, expecting something immediate, something decisive. But I did not rush. I never rushed when the answer was already there, and I walked to the window instead, looking out over a city that had always belonged to me in ways I never questioned, lights stretching for miles, every street carrying a story I could trace if I needed to, every shadow hiding something I had already learned how to control. And for the first time in a long time, I realized control had limits, not in the way people think, not in power or influence, but in consequence. Because every decision creates something you cannot always see until it is too late. And I turned back slowly, my eyes finding the screen again. That same car frozen in a frame where it had lingered just a second too long. And I told them to isolate it, to track it back, not just tonight, not just the last few hours, but days, weeks if necessary. Because I needed to know when this started, not when it ended. And they moved again, faster now. Understanding that this was no longer about gathering information, it was about finding the beginning of something that had already reached too far. And while they worked, I let my thoughts drift back to her, not to the hospital bed, not to the silence of machines and the weight of uncertainty, but to the way she used to look at me like I had a choice, like I was not already defined by everything I had built. And I wondered if she had known, even then, that one day I would stand in a room like this, watching a version of her I could not protect, trying to understand a mistake I had not yet named. And the realization came quietly, almost gently, that this was not about finding someone to blame. It was about finding the moment I should have stepped in and did not. The moment I chose distance over presence, control over connection, and I exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of acceptance, because once you see that moment, you cannot unsee it, and you cannot pretend it does not matter. And that was when one of them spoke, careful, measured, saying they had found something, not definitive, not complete, but enough to shift the direction of everything. And I walked back without hesitation, my attention narrowing as the screen changed, a different angle, a clearer image, the car stopping briefly 2 blocks away from where she had last been seen, the driver never stepping out, never making a move that would draw attention, and yet it stayed there, waiting, like it knew exactly how much time it had. And I felt it then, not fear, not doubt, but certainty, the kind that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. And I said one word, just one, continue, because I knew we were close now, closer than we had been all night. And as the footage shifted again, showing her walking into frame, unaware, unguarded, completely herself in a world that had already decided something else for her, I realized the most important part was not what happened next, it was why it happened at all. And that answer was not going to be simple, not going to be distant. It was going to lead somewhere I already knew, somewhere I had built, somewhere I had trusted. And as the image froze on her silhouette under a streetlight, just seconds before everything changed, I understood that whatever I was about to uncover would not just change what I did next. It would change who I had been all along. The moment you realize the truth is already inside your world, everything changes, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet shift that makes every detail sharper, every assumption heavier. And I stood there watching that frozen frame of her under the streetlight, knowing that whatever came next was not going to lead me somewhere new. It was going to lead me back into something I had built, something I had trusted without question. And I exhaled slowly, my hand resting against the edge of the table again as I told them to run the plate, not just through public records, not just through what was easy to access, but through everything, every connection, every network that existed beneath the surface of this city, because I did not want a partial answer. I wanted the whole truth, even if it was inconvenient. Especially if it was inconvenient. And they moved quickly, faster than before, because they could feel it now, the direction of this, the weight of it, the way the room had shifted from routine to something far more precise. And I did not sit, I did not pace. I stayed exactly where I was, still and focused, because movement would not change the outcome, only attention would. And minutes passed in a silence that felt heavier than any noise, broken only by the soft hum of machines and the occasional murmur of voices that never rose above what was necessary. And then it came, not with urgency, not with alarm, but with certainty, a name attached to a company that should not have mattered, a logistics firm that operated quietly, efficiently, the kind of operation that moved things from one place to another without attracting attention, the kind I had approved years ago without hesitation because it served a purpose, because it fit into the structure I had created, and I felt it. Then, not as a reaction, but as recognition, because I knew that name, not as a threat, but as a decision I had once made and then forgotten. And that was the problem, forgetting, assuming that once something is set in motion it will continue exactly as intended, ignoring the fact that people change, that intentions shift, that control is not permanent unless you maintain it. And I stepped closer to the screen, my eyes narrowing slightly as I looked at the details, the routes, the timestamps, the connections that now formed a pattern I could not ignore. And I asked a simple question, who runs it now? Not who founded it, not who signed the original papers, but who is in charge today, because that was the only answer that mattered. And there was another pause, shorter this time, sharper, because they understood what I was asking and what it implied. And when the name came back, it did not surprise me, not completely, but it settled into me in a way that made everything else fall into place. Someone I had trusted, someone I had allowed to operate without oversight because they had earned it once, because they had proven themselves in a time that now felt distant and irrelevant. And I closed my eyes for just a second, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. Because once you see the full picture, you do not need to look at it twice. And I opened them again, already knowing what needed to happen next, not in terms of action, but in terms of understanding, because this was not about reacting. It was about correcting something that had gone wrong long before tonight. And I turned away from the screen, my mind already moving through the steps, not rushed, not scattered, but precise, like placing pieces back into a structure that had been quietly shifting without notice. And I reached for my phone again, dialing a different number this time, one that connected directly, no layers, no intermediaries, because there are moments when distance becomes a liability, and this was one of them. And when the line connected, I did not speak immediately. I let the silence settle first, because silence has a way of revealing awareness, of showing whether the other person already understands why you are calling. And when they spoke, their voice was steady, respectful, unchanged. It confirmed what I already knew, that they had not expected this call, not tonight, not like this. And I said their name once, clearly, without accusation, without explanation, just enough to anchor the conversation in something real. And I asked where they were, not because I did not know, but because I needed to hear their answer, needed to measure the space between truth and instinct. And they told me, calmly, confidently, and I listened, not to the words, but to the tone, the pace, the absence of hesitation. And I realized something important in that moment, something that made everything else sharper, that whatever had happened to her was not a mistake, not in the way people usually mean. It was the result of a system that had continued without correction, without reflection, without me. And I ended the call without raising my voice, without making a demand, because none of that was necessary yet. And I stood there for a moment longer, the room waiting, the city outside still moving like nothing had changed. And I knew that by the time the sun came up, everything would be different, not because I would force it to be, but because I would finally see it clearly enough to change it. And I turned back toward the door, toward the night, toward the path that had already begun to reveal itself, knowing that the next step would not just determine what happened to her, it would determine whether I deserved to hear her say my name again when she woke up. I have learned that some answers do not come with resistance, they come with cooperation, and that is when you know something is wrong. Because people who have nothing to hide ask questions, they stall, they push back. But when someone gives you exactly what you ask for without hesitation, it means they have already decided how the story should look. And as I stepped into the building where he said he was, everything felt too clean, too quiet. The kind of controlled environment that suggests preparation instead of routine. And I walked in without announcing myself, without needing to, because presence has always been enough. But tonight it was not about being recognized. It was about observing. And he was already there, standing near the window like he had been waiting, like he had known this moment was coming even if he did not know exactly when. And when he turned to face me, his expression did not change, calm, respectful, familiar, the same way it had always been. And that was what made it different, because nothing had shifted on the surface, and yet everything underneath it had. And I stopped a few feet away, not close enough to invade, not far enough to disconnect, just enough space to let the truth settle between us without being forced. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, because silence has its own language, one that reveals more than words if you let it. And I watched him the same way I had watched those screens earlier, not looking for movement, but for pattern, for anything that did not align with what I already knew. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, measured, the kind of tone people use when they believe they are still in control of the conversation. And he asked what this was about, as if he needed clarification, as if the call I had made earlier had not already told him everything he needed to know. And I did not answer immediately, because answering too quickly gives people something to react to. And I did not want a reaction. I wanted the truth. And I stepped closer, just slightly enough, for him to understand that this was not a casual visit, not a routine check. And I said her name, nothing else, just Maya, and I watched the way it landed. The way it passed through his expression like something he had expected but hoped would not come. And there it was, not fear, not guilt in the obvious sense, but awareness, the kind that cannot be hidden completely no matter how controlled you are. And that was enough, more than enough, because I did not need him to confess, I needed him to understand that I already knew this was connected. And I asked one question, simple, direct, why was she followed? Not accused, not framed, just asked. Because sometimes the way you ask matters more than what you ask. And he held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, calculating, deciding, and then he answered, not fully, not completely, but enough to confirm what I had already seen, that there had been an operation, that it had been approved within the structure, that it had not been meant to involve her. that she had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I listened without interrupting, because interruptions break the flow of truth, and I needed him to keep talking, to keep explaining, to fill the silence with details he might not have planned to share, and he did, mentioning timing, mentioning routes, mentioning the assumption that no one outside the target would be affected, and that was when I felt it. Not anger, not yet, but something sharper, something quieter, the realization that this was not a single mistake. It was a chain of decisions that had been allowed to exist because I had not been paying attention, because I had trusted the system to maintain itself, because I had believed control was something you could set once and forget, and I let out a slow breath, not to calm myself, but to acknowledge that truth, because once you acknowledge it, you cannot pretend it does not matter. And I looked at him again, really looked this time, at the man I had trusted, at the structure I had allowed him to run, at the consequences that now stood between us without needing to be named, and I asked another question, quieter this time. Did you verify the surroundings? Did you confirm who else was there? And he hesitated, just slightly, and that hesitation was everything, because it told me what he did not say, that assumptions had been made, that shortcuts had been taken, that precision had been replaced by efficiency, and I nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding, because this was not about a single person making a single error. It was about a system that had shifted away from what I had built it to be, and I stepped back, creating distance again, not as a retreat, but as a recalibration, because what came next was not about him. Not really. It was about what I would do with this information, about how I would correct something that had already caused damage I could not undo. And I spoke again, my voice even, controlled, but carrying something beneath it that did not need to be emphasized. From now on, every operation is verified twice. Every route is confirmed. Every variable is accounted for. No assumptions, no shortcuts. And I paused, just long enough for it to settle. And then I added, and anything connected to her stops immediately, completely, no exceptions. And he nodded, not because he agreed, but because he understood there was no alternative, and I turned to leave without another word, because there was nothing else to say in that moment, nothing that would change what had already happened. And as I walked out into the night again, the air colder than before, the city still moving like it always did, I realized something I had not allowed myself to think until now, that fixing the system would not be enough, that correcting the structure would not change what she was going through in that hospital room. And as I reached for my phone again, already knowing I would go back to her, already knowing I would sit there and wait as long as it took, I understood that this was no longer about control or power or even justice. It was about whether she would open her eyes and say my name again, not because she had to, but because she chose to, and for the first time in a long time, that was the only outcome that mattered. There is a moment when the noise fades and all that is left is the sound of a single breath, and I realized as I stepped back into that hospital room that everything outside of it had already been decided, corrected, redirected, but none of that mattered here, not where she lay still against white sheets that did not belong to her, not where machines measured time in quiet beeps instead of seconds. And I moved closer without hesitation this time. No pause, no distance, because distance had already cost too much. And I sat beside her, the chair cold beneath me, the air too still, and I took her hand again like it was something I had never learned how to hold properly until now. And for a while I said nothing, because words have weight, and I did not want to say anything that would not reach her, and I watched her instead, the slow rise and fall of her chest, the faint movement that told me she was still fighting even when she looked like she had already given up, and I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice to something that belonged only to this space, telling her I was here, that I was not leaving, not this time, not again, and the strange thing was not that I said it. It was that I meant it in a way I had never meant anything before, because this was not a promise built on control or outcome. It was a decision built on presence, on staying even when staying did not guarantee anything. And I let my thumb move slightly against her hand, a small motion, almost nothing, but enough to remind myself she was real, not a memory, not a consequence, but someone still here, still within reach if I did not let go. And time moved differently in that room, slower, quieter, stretching in a way that made every second feel deliberate, and I found myself thinking about things I had not allowed myself to think about before, not strategy, not structure, Not the system I had spent years building, but moments, small ones, the way she used to tilt her head when she disagreed with me. The way she would not step back even when everyone else did. The way she once said my name like it was not something heavy but something simple, and I realized how much of that I had taken for granted. How easily I had assumed it would always be there, always waiting, always unchanged, and I exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the quiet of the room, and I told her something I had never said out loud, not to anyone, not even to myself, that I should have stayed, that I should have chosen differently, that I should have been there when it mattered instead of assuming there would always be another chance. And the words did not feel like weakness, they felt like truth, the kind you cannot ignore once you see it clearly. And I kept talking, not because I expected a response, but because silence was no longer something I could hide behind, telling her what I had done, what I had changed, how nothing connected to her would ever be touched again, how every part of the system that had allowed this to happen had already been corrected, not out of obligation, but because it was the only way forward that made sense anymore. And as I spoke, I noticed something small, something easy to miss if you were not paying attention. The slightest shift in the rhythm of the machine. Beside her, not dramatic, not sudden, just enough to make me stop for a second, my eyes moving from her face to the monitor and back again. And I felt it then, not certainty, but possibility, the kind that does not promise anything but refuses to disappear. And I leaned closer, my voice quieter now, telling her she needed to stay, not for me, not because of anything I had done, but because she still had something left to say, something that had nothing to do with the world I came from. And for a moment, nothing changed. The room stayed still, the air stayed heavy, and then her fingers moved again, just slightly, curling against mine like a response that had been delayed but not lost. And I held still, not tightening my grip, not reacting too quickly, just letting it happen, letting it exist without forcing it into something more than it was. And I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not yet, but something close, something that made the space in my chest feel less tight, less empty, and I stayed there, not moving, not looking away, because this was where I needed to be, not out there, not in the city, not in the system I had spent years controlling, but here, beside her, waiting without trying to control the outcome. And as the minutes passed, I realized something I had never understood before. That control was never about making everything happen the way you want. It was about knowing when to let something unfold without interference. And this moment, was not mine to control. It was hers, and all I could do was stay. And as I sat there, her hand still in mine, the faint warmth grounding me in something real, I understood that whatever happened next would not be decided by power or influence or anything I had built. It would be decided by her, by whether she chose to open her eyes again. And for the first time in a long time, I was willing to wait as long as it took to find out. Sometimes the smallest change feels louder than anything else, and I noticed it before the machines did, before the quiet rhythm beside her adjusted in a way only someone watching too closely would catch. The subtle difference in the way her fingers rested against mine, not just movement, not just reflex, but intention, like something inside her was reaching back, and I held still, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that this moment was fragile in a way I could not control. And for once, I did not try to. I did not tighten my grip. I did not speak immediately. I just stayed exactly where I was, letting the silence hold what words could not. And then her breathing shifted, just slightly, not enough to alarm anyone, not enough to draw attention from outside the room, but enough for me, enough to make everything else fall away. And I leaned forward slowly, my voice low, steady, saying her name like it was something I had learned how to say differently now, not as a claim, not as a command, but as something I was asking for permission to hold on to. And for a second, nothing happened. The room remained still, the air unchanged, and then her eyelids moved, just barely, a faint flutter that would have been easy to miss if I had not been watching her like everything depended on it. And maybe it did, and I felt something shift in my chest, not relief, not yet, but something close, something that made the weight I had been carrying feel less absolute. And I stayed there, not moving, not looking away, waiting without forcing the moment into something it was not ready to become. And when her eyes opened, it was not sudden, not dramatic, it was slow, uncertain, like she was deciding whether this world was still something she wanted to return to. And when they finally focused, when they found me, there was a pause, a quiet space where recognition settled in. And I saw it. Not fear, not confusion, but something softer. Something that reminded me of every moment I had almost forgotten. And her lips moved slightly, forming a sound that did not fully come through at first. And I leaned closer without thinking, my hand still wrapped around hers, grounding both of us in something real. And then I heard it, my name. Not strong, not clear, but there, unmistakable. And it did not feel like a victory. It did not feel like something I had earned. It felt like something I had been given a second chance to protect. And I exhaled slowly, a breath I had not realized I had been holding. And I told her I was here, that she was safe, not as a promise of control, but as a commitment to presence. And she blinked again, slower this time, her gaze steadying, adjusting, and I could see the questions forming behind it, the confusion, the memory trying to reconnect with what had happened. And I shook my head slightly before she could try to speak again, telling her she did not need to explain anything, not now, not yet, that she just needed to stay, to breathe, to let herself come back one moment at a time. And she watched me for a second longer, like she was measuring something, not my words, but the space between them, the way I said them, the absence of anything she might have expected from me before. And then her fingers tightened again around mine, a little stronger this time, not enough to hurt, just enough to confirm that she was choosing to stay. And that was when the door opened quietly behind me, a doctor stepping in, stopping short when he saw her eyes open, his expression shifting from routine to something closer to surprise. And I stood slowly, not because I wanted to leave, but because I understood this was not my moment to control. And he moved closer, speaking in calm, careful tones, asking her simple questions, guiding her back with a kind of patience I had never learned but now respected in a way I had not before. And I stepped back just enough to give them space, but not enough to disconnect, my attention still fixed on her, still anchored in the way she responded, the way she stayed present even when it would have been easier to drift away again. And after a few minutes, the doctor turned to me, his voice quieter now, telling me she was stable, that she would need rest, that recovery would take time. And I nodded once, not because I needed the explanation, but because I understood what he was really saying, that she was here, that she had chosen to stay, that everything else would follow. And when he left, the room settled again into that quiet stillness. But it felt different now, less heavy, less uncertain, and I moved back to her side, sitting down, again without hesitation. And she looked at me, really looked this time, like she was seeing something new, something she had not expected to find. And I held her gaze without looking away, because there was nothing left to hide, nothing left to control, only something to protect. And she spoke again, her voice still weak, but clearer now, asking what happened. And I paused for a second, not because I did not know the answer, but because I understood that how I answered mattered more than what I said. And I told her the truth, not all of it, not the parts that would pull her back into something she did not need right now, but enough to be real, enough to be honest, that something had gone wrong, that it had been handled, that she was safe now. And she listened, her expression steady, and then she asked something I had not expected, not about what had happened, not about who was responsible, but about why I was here. And for a moment, I did not answer, because that question did not have a simple explanation. It did not fit into the structure I had built or the decisions I had made. And I realized that the answer was not something I could explain in the way I was used to. It was something I had to say without control, without calculation. And I told her the only thing that made sense, that I was here because she said my name. And she held my gaze for a second longer, something shifting in her expression, something I could not fully define but did not need to. And she nodded, just slightly, like that was enough for now. And as the silence settled again, not heavy this time but calm, I understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something I had not planned, something I could not control. And for the first time in a long time, I was not trying to. The quiet after a question can tell you more than the answer itself. And when she asked why I was here, it stayed between us longer than anything else in that room. Not heavy, not uncomfortable, just present, like something waiting to be understood instead of explained. And I watched her as she processed what I had said, the way her eyes held mine without hesitation, without fear. And it reminded me of something I had almost forgotten, that she had always looked at me like that, like I was not something to avoid but something to see clearly. And I did not look away this time. Not like I used to. Not like I had when things were easier to ignore. And she shifted slightly against the pillow, a small movement that seemed to take more effort than it should, and I noticed it immediately. The way her hand tightened just a fraction around mine, as if grounding herself in something familiar, and I adjusted without thinking, my grip steady, supportive, not controlling, and the difference in that alone felt like something I had never learned how to do until now. And she exhaled slowly, her gaze softening just a little, like she was deciding something internally, something she had not said yet. And when she spoke again, her voice was still quiet but clearer, asking not about what had happened but about what would happen next. And that question lingered differently, because it was not about the past, it was about the future, about whether anything had truly changed or if this was just another moment that would fade once everything returned to normal. And I understood that without her having to explain it, and I did not answer immediately, not because I did not know, but because I needed to make sure that whatever I said was not something I would later walk away from. And I looked at her, really looked, at the strength that was still there even in this fragile state, at the way she held herself even when she had every reason not to, and I realized that she was not asking for promises, she was asking for truth, and I gave it to her, telling her that things would not go back to what they were. Not because they could not, but because I would not allow them to, and I did not say it like a declaration, not like something meant to impress or convince, just something steady, something real. And she studied my face for a second longer, like she was searching for something she had not found before, and whatever she saw, it made her nod slightly, not fully convinced, but willing to believe for now. And that was more than I deserved, more than I had expected, and the room fell quiet again. But this time it felt different. Not uncertain, not heavy, just still, like something had shifted into place without needing to be forced, and I stayed beside her, not speaking, not moving, just present, because I was beginning to understand that presence was not about doing something, it was about not leaving. And time passed in that quiet, measured by the steady rhythm of the machines and the soft rise and fall of her breathing, and I noticed the small changes, the way her color returned just slightly, the way her hand no longer felt as fragile in mine, the way her eyes stayed open longer each time before closing again, and it was not dramatic, not immediate, but it was enough to show that she was still choosing to stay, still finding her way back one moment at a time. And at some point, she drifted into sleep, not the kind that feels like escape, but the kind that feels like recovery, and I did not move when it happened, did not pull my hand away, did not step back. Because I knew that even in sleep, presence mattered, and I stayed there, watching, listening, thinking about everything that had led to this moment, and everything that would follow. And for the first time, those thoughts were not about control or outcome. They were about responsibility, about what it meant to hold something that could be lost if you were not careful. And I realized that what I had built, everything I had controlled for so long, had never required me to be careful in this way, had never required me to consider something beyond strategy or structure. And that was why this felt different, why this mattered in a way I had not been prepared for. And as I sat there, the quiet stretching around me, I understood that this was not just about her recovery. It was about what came after, about whether I would return to the same patterns once she was no longer in danger, or whether this moment would actually change something deeper, something permanent. And I did not have an answer for that yet, not completely. But I knew one thing for certain, that walking away was no longer an option, not in the way it had been before. And as I looked at her, at the calm expression that had replaced the tension from earlier, I felt something settle into place inside me, not a decision, not a plan, but a direction, something I would follow even if I did not fully understand where it would lead. And I stayed there as the night slowly gave way to the first hint of morning light through the window, the city outside beginning to wake, while everything inside this room remained still. And I realized that for once, I was not in a hurry to leave, not in a hurry to return to anything else, because this quiet, this presence, this moment where she was still here and I had not lost her, was the only place I needed to be, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Morning does not arrive all at once, it seeps in slowly, light stretching across the room in quiet lines that do not demand attention, but change everything anyway. And I noticed it before I realized how long I had been sitting there. The way the darkness softened into something less absolute. The way the edges of the world returned without noise. And I shifted slightly in the chair, not because I was uncomfortable, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to be anywhere else. And when I looked at her, she was still asleep. But it was different now. Not the heavy stillness from before. Not the kind that made you question if she would wake at all. This was lighter, steadier, like her body had decided to stay even when it could have let go. And I let my gaze linger there for a moment longer, memorizing the small details I had overlooked before, the way her hand rested in mine without tension, the way her breathing carried a rhythm that felt almost familiar again, and I realized something then, something simple but impossible to ignore, that I had not just stayed the night, I had chosen it, without hesitation, without calculation, without considering anything beyond this room. And that was not something I recognized in myself, not before now, and I leaned back slightly, letting out a slow breath, my eyes moving toward the window where the city was beginning to move again, cars in the distance, people returning to routines that felt unchanged from the outside, and for a moment, I wondered how many of them had no idea how close everything can come to ending without warning, how quickly a single moment can shift the direction of everything. And I turned back to her, grounding myself in something real instead of something abstract. And that was when I noticed the small movement, the slight shift in her expression before her eyes opened again, slower this time, more certain, like she knew where she was returning to. And I sat forward without thinking, my hand still steady around hers, not tightening, not pulling, just there. And when her gaze found mine, it did not carry the same uncertainty as before. It was clearer now, more present, and there was something else in it too, something that felt like awareness instead of confusion. And she took a slow breath before speaking, her voice still quiet, but no longer fragile, asking how long I had been there. And I did not measure it in hours, did not think about the time that had passed in any practical sense. I just told her the truth, that I had not left, and she studied me for a second, like she was weighing that answer against something she expected, and I could see the shift in her expression, not surprise exactly, but recognition, like something was finally aligning with what she had believed before. And she looked away for a moment, her gaze moving toward the window, taking in the light, the morning, the fact that everything had continued while she had been somewhere else entirely. And then she asked something that carried more weight than anything else she had said so far, not about the night, not about the details, but about whether this would change anything. And the question did not feel like doubt. It felt like a boundary, like something she was placing carefully between what had been and what could be. And I did not answer right away, not because I did not know, but because I understood that this was not something I could respond to with certainty unless I meant it completely. And I looked at her, at the steadiness in her eyes, at the strength that had returned in ways that had nothing to do with physical recovery. And I told her that it already had. That things had changed the moment she said my name, the moment I chose to come, the moment I stayed, and I did not add anything else, did not try to explain it further, because some truths do not need elaboration, they need consistency. And she held my gaze for a moment longer, and then she nodded, not fully accepting it, not yet, but not rejecting it either, and that was enough, more than enough for now. And the door opened quietly again, a nurse stepping in with that same careful energy that filled this place, checking the monitors, adjusting something near the bed, speaking softly to her in a way that felt routine but still kind. And I stepped back slightly, giving them space without leaving entirely, my attention still anchored to her, still aware of every small change, every shift that told me she was still here, still choosing to stay. And after a few minutes, the nurse left, the room settling back into that quiet rhythm that no longer felt heavy. And she looked at me again, her expression softer now, less guarded, and she asked if I was going to leave, not as a demand, not as an accusation, just a question. And I shook my head without hesitation, telling her I was not going anywhere. Not today, not in the way I had before. And she let out a small breath, something close to relief, but not quite. And she closed her eyes again, not drifting away this time, just resting, trusting that when she opened them again, I would still be there. And as I sat back down beside her, the chair familiar now in a way it had not been before, I realized something I had not expected. That staying did not feel like a sacrifice. It did not feel like something I had to justify or manage. It felt like the only thing that made sense. And as the morning continued to unfold outside, the city returning to its rhythm, I understood that whatever came next would not be about returning to what I had been. It would be about deciding what I was willing to become. And for the first time, that decision did not feel like control. It felt like responsibility. And I stayed there, not because I had to, but because I chose to. And that difference changed everything. Change does not announce itself. It reveals itself in what you no longer recognize as normal. And I noticed it in the way the room no longer felt temporary, in the way sitting beside her no longer felt like something I would eventually leave behind. And as the hours moved forward without urgency, I realized that time had stopped measuring anything important, because nothing outside this space required my attention in the way it once had. And that alone would have been unthinkable before. And she noticed it too, not in words, not directly, but in the way she watched me when she thought I was not paying attention, the way her gaze lingered just a second longer than necessary, like she was trying to understand whether this version of me was real or just something created by the moment. And I did not look away when I caught her watching. I let her see that I was aware, that I was not hiding behind distance or distraction anymore. And she held my gaze for a second before asking something simple, something that should not have carried weight, but did anyway. What about your world? And the way she said it made it clear she was not asking out of curiosity. She was asking because she knew that world did not pause for anyone, not even for me. And I leaned back slightly, considering the question not in terms of explanation, but in terms of truth. And I told her it was still there, still moving, still functioning exactly as it always had, but that it no longer decided where I needed to be. And she studied my face again, like she was measuring whether that answer would hold once everything returned to normal. And I understood the doubt without needing her to say it, because I had lived long enough to know that people rarely change without reason, and even more rarely without reverting back when the pressure fades. And I did not try to convince her otherwise. I did not offer anything more than what I had already said, because this was not something I could prove with words, only with time. And she seemed to accept that, at least for now, her attention shifting slightly as she adjusted against the pillows, stronger than before, but still careful, still aware of her own limits. And I reached out instinctively to steady her when she moved, my hand resting lightly at her shoulder for just a second, not guiding, not controlling, just there in case she needed it. And she did not pull away, did not question it. She simply allowed it. And that small moment felt more significant than anything else that had happened, because it was not built on urgency or fear. It was built on trust, something I had never considered something I needed to earn before. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was steady, like something had settled into place without needing to be forced. And after a while, she spoke again, her voice stronger now, asking if I had found out what happened. And this time the question carried a different kind of weight, not fear, not urgency, but clarity, like she was ready to understand even if the answer was not simple. And I paused for a moment, not because I did not know what to say, but because I understood that this was a line I could not cross carelessly, that what I told her now would shape how she saw everything that followed. And I chose my words carefully, telling her that it was not random, that it had been connected to something within my world, something that had already been addressed, already been corrected. And I did not go further than that, did not bring her into details she did not need, because this was not her burden to carry. And she listened without interrupting, her expression steady, and then she nodded slowly, like she had expected that answer even if she had hoped for something else. And I could see the moment it settled in, the quiet understanding that being connected to me meant being closer to things she had never asked for. And I felt something shift in response to that, something that made the space between us feel different, not distant, but more aware. And I leaned forward slightly, my voice lower now, telling her that nothing like this would happen again, not as a promise built on certainty, but as a commitment built on change. And she looked at me for a long second, searching for something deeper than the words themselves. And whatever she found, it made her exhale slowly, not fully reassured, but willing to stay in this moment, without pulling away. And that was enough, more than enough. And the rest of the day moved quietly around us, doctors coming and going, routine checks, conversations that stayed within the boundaries of recovery and stability, and I remained where I was through all of it, not stepping out, not taking calls beyond what was absolutely necessary, not allowing anything to pull me away from this space. And each time she opened her eyes, each time she looked at me and found me still there, something in her expression softened just a little more, like trust was not something she gave all at once, but something she allowed to grow in small, deliberate moments. And as the light outside shifted again, moving toward afternoon, I realized that this was not something temporary. Not something that would end when she left this room. It was something that would follow us beyond it. Something that would test whether what I had said would hold when everything else returned. And as I sat there, watching her rest, her hand still loosely in mine, I understood that this was no longer about proving anything to her. It was about becoming someone who did not need to be questioned in the first place. And that was not something I had ever tried to be before, but it was something I was not willing to walk away from now. Trust is not built in what you say when things are difficult. It is built in what you do when things become normal again. And I realized that as the hours turned into something quieter, less urgent, as the room no longer felt like a place suspended between fear and relief, but something closer to ordinary. And that was when it mattered most. Not when she was at risk, not when everything demanded my attention, but now, when nothing was forcing me to stay except my own decision, and I stayed, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because leaving no longer made sense in the way it once had, and she noticed, not immediately, not with questions, but with the way her eyes followed me when I moved, even slightly, the way she seemed to expect that at some point I would step out, take a call, return to something else, and each time I did not. Each time I remained exactly where I was. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to be real, enough to be seen if you were paying attention. And I was, more than I had ever been. And she spoke again in the afternoon, her voice steady now, asking about things that were not immediate, not about what had happened or what would happen next, but about small things, about how long she would be here, about what recovery would look like, about whether she would be able to return to her routine. And I answered what I could, not as someone in control, but as someone present, someone willing to sit in uncertainty instead of trying to reshape it into something predictable. And when I did not have an answer, I said that, too. And that honesty, simple as it was, seemed to matter more than anything else, because she nodded, accepting it without hesitation, like truth was something she recognized even when it was incomplete. And at some point she asked about leaving. Not the hospital, not yet, but what would happen after, and that question carried a weight that had nothing to do with location. It was about distance, about whether what existed in this room would follow us outside of it, and I did not respond immediately, because I understood what she was really asking, whether I would return to who I had been once this moment passed. And I looked at her, at the steadiness that had returned, at the clarity in her gaze, and I told her that I did not know exactly what it would look like yet, but I knew it would not be the same, because I was not the same, and I let that sit between us without trying to define it further, because some things need to remain open to be real. And she held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded slowly, like that was enough for now. Not a guarantee, not a promise, but something she was willing to hold on to. And the rest of the afternoon passed in a quiet rhythm, not empty, not silent, but steady, conversations coming and going, moments of rest, small exchanges that felt natural in a way I had not expected. And I remained there through all of it, not checking the time, not thinking about anything beyond the space we were in. And it was not until later, when the light outside began to fade again, that I noticed something else, something subtle but undeniable. The way she reached for my hand without hesitation when she shifted, the way it had become something expected instead of something uncertain, and I responded without thinking, my hand finding hers with the same ease, the same steadiness. And that simple action carried more meaning than anything I could have said, because it was not forced, it was not questioned, it just was. And I realized then that this was how change happened, not in declarations or decisions, but in repetition, in the quiet consistency of staying when it would be easier to leave, of choosing presence when distraction is always available. And as the room settled into evening, the sounds softer, the movement slower, I understood that this was no longer about what had happened. It was about what we were building in its aftermath, something that did not rely on the past, but was shaped by what we chose now. And I stayed there, not because I needed to prove anything, but because it was the only place I wanted to be. And as she rested again, her hand still loosely in mine, I realized that the world outside could continue exactly as it always had, but it would no longer define where I belonged, because that had already changed, and I was not going back. There comes a point when staying is no longer a question. It becomes a pattern, something so consistent it begins to redefine everything around it. And I realized that as the night settled again, softer than the one before, less urgent, but no less important, because nothing was forcing me to be here anymore. There were no alarms, no sudden changes, no reason that demanded my presence except the one I had chosen. And I remained exactly where I was, not checking the time, not thinking about anything beyond the space we shared, and she noticed, not in the way she had before, not with quiet observation or unspoken questions, but with something more direct, something that did not hide behind uncertainty. And when she looked at me this time, there was no hesitation in it, no searching, just clarity, and she asked me something simple, something that should not have carried weight, but did anyway. How long are you going to stay? And I understood immediately that she was not asking about hours or days. She was asking about intention, about whether this was temporary or something that would continue when everything returned to normal. And I leaned back slightly, not to create distance but to give the question the space it deserved. And I told her the truth, not shaped, not softened, just clear, that I was not leaving until she did, and even then, not in the way I had before. And she held my gaze for a moment, letting that settle, and I could see the shift in her expression, not surprise, not relief, but something quieter, something steadier, like she was allowing herself to believe it without needing to test it immediately. And she nodded once, slowly, and that was enough, more than enough, and the room fell into that familiar quiet again. But it was different now, not uncertain, not fragile, just calm, like something had finally stabilized without needing to be forced. And she shifted slightly, stronger than before, adjusting herself without assistance. And I watched without intervening, not because I did not want to help, but because I understood that she needed to do this on her own, needed to feel that she could. And when she finished, she looked at me again, a small hint of something almost like a smile at the corner of her lips. And it was the first time I had seen it since she woke up, and it did not feel like a moment to react to. It felt like something to recognize, something to hold on to without disrupting it. And I nodded slightly in return, not making it bigger than it was, just acknowledging it. And she leaned back against the pillow, her eyes closing for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but out of rest, the kind that comes when you no longer feel like you have to stay alert to what might happen next. And I stayed there, watching, listening, understanding that this was not just recovery, it was trust rebuilding itself in small, deliberate ways. And as the minutes passed, she opened her eyes again, her gaze softer now, less guarded, and she spoke again, her voice steady, asking if I had ever thought about leaving everything behind. And the question caught me off guard, not because I had not considered it before, but because I had never allowed myself to take it seriously. And I did not answer immediately, because this was not a question about possibility, it was about willingness. And I looked at her, at the quiet strength in her expression, at the way she asked it without expectation, just curiosity, and I realized that the answer had already begun to form long before she asked it. In every moment I had chosen to stay, in every decision I had made since that night, and I told her that I had not thought about it before, not in a real way, but that now, I could not ignore the idea anymore. And she studied my face, like she was trying to see how far that thought went, whether it was just something said in the moment or something that had already started to take shape. And I did not try to define it further, because I knew that words would not make it real, only actions would. And she seemed to understand that, nodding slightly, not pushing, not questioning, just accepting it as something unfinished. And the conversation faded into silence again. But it was not empty. It was full of something unspoken, something that did not need to be named yet. And I sat there, my hand still loosely in hers, feeling the steady warmth that had once felt fragile, but now felt certain. And I realized that everything had already changed, not in a single moment, not in something dramatic, but in the accumulation of choices that led here, choices I could not take back and did not want to. And as the night continued, quieter than before, I understood that whatever came next would not be about returning to what I had built. It would be about deciding what was worth building next. And for the first time, that decision did not feel like something I had to control. It felt like something I was willing to follow, wherever it led. The last thing I expected was that change would feel quiet. Not like something breaking apart, but like something settling into place. And as the early morning light returned again, softer than before, I realized that nothing in this room felt temporary anymore. Not the chair I had not left, not the steady rhythm of her breathing, not even the silence that now felt more like peace than uncertainty. And I looked at her as she slept. Not the fragile stillness from before, but something stronger. Something grounded, like she had crossed something invisible and decided to stay on this side of it. And I let my hand rest against hers without thinking, the contact no longer careful or hesitant, just natural, like it belonged there. And I understood in that moment that this was no longer about what had happened. It was about what we were choosing now, what we were building without needing to name it yet. And when she opened her eyes again, slower but certain, her gaze finding mine like it had learned where to look, there was no question in it this time. No searching, just recognition, and I leaned slightly forward, not because I needed to say anything, but because being closer felt right, and she watched me for a second before speaking, her voice steady, asking if I was still here, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was unexpected, but because it meant something simple, something real, and I told her I was, and she nodded, like that was all she needed to hear, like the answer mattered more than the question itself. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was full of everything we had not said but both understood, and I stayed there, not moving, not looking away, because there was nothing pulling me anywhere else anymore. And she shifted slightly, stronger now, sitting up just enough to change her position, and I instinctively moved to help, but paused halfway, letting her decide, letting her do it on her own, and she did, steady, controlled, and when she settled back, she looked at me again. Something softer in her expression, something that felt like acceptance instead of uncertainty, and she asked one last question, not about the past, not about what had happened, but about what this meant, about whether this would continue when she walked out of this room. And I did not hesitate this time, not because I had prepared an answer, but because I already knew it, and I told her that it would, not because I could control what came next, but because I would choose it every day, in ways that mattered. In ways that did not disappear when things became easy again, and she held my gaze for a long second, like she was measuring that against everything she had known before, everything she had experienced, and then she nodded, slowly, not as a decision, but as a beginning, and that was enough, more than enough, and the room felt different after that, not because anything had changed physically, but because something had settled between us, something unspoken but understood. And I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not thinking about what came next in terms of control or outcome. I was thinking about it in terms of presence, of showing up, of staying when it mattered. And as the morning continued to unfold, the city outside moving in ways that no longer defined me, I understood that everything I had built, everything I had controlled, had never required this kind of commitment, this kind of consistency. And that was why it mattered now. Why it felt different, because this was not something I could delegate, not something I could step away from without consequence. And I looked at her again, at the calm in her expression, at the quiet strength that had always been there even when I had not seen it clearly. And I realized that she had not changed me by asking, by demanding, or by forcing anything. She had changed me simply by being someone worth staying for. And that truth settled into me in a way that did not feel heavy. It felt clear, like something I should have understood long ago, but did not until now. And I stayed there, not because I had to, not because I was expected to, but because I chose to, and as her hand found mine again, without hesitation, as her fingers rested there like it was the most natural thing in the world, I understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something I had never allowed myself to have before, something that did not rely on control or power or certainty, but on something far simpler and far more difficult to maintain. And as I sat there, the light filling the room, the quiet steady around us, I realized that for the first time, I was not trying to own the moment, I was letting it exist, and that made all the difference.